Welcome, everyone. We are at 8 o'clock over here, so I know this especially for the East Coast, we are a little bit late on time, so I do want to make sure that everyone has enough time to get in their questions and answers and learn more about dermatopathology and the Dermatopathology Fellowship process. All right, I'm going to share my screen over here just so that everybody can meet everyone who's going to be part of this fellowship forum. First off, before we start, I really do want to thank the ASDP for putting this together. This was an idea we had in terms of making sure that the fellowship process was more accessible to trainees, and now it's happening today. And I really also want to make sure that we have the opportunity to thank our staff, including Leah Smith, who's been really indispensable in putting together this forum. Now, who are we? My name is Alex Flamm. I'm coming to you over from Penn State. I'm a derm-trained derm path, and I'm one of the course co-directors, and will be helping to moderate the sessions today. The other course co-directors are Dr. Catherine Chung. Catherine is a derm path over at Ohio State. And Rachel Kowal, who's a path derm path, who's coming to us over from Indiana. And then our panelists. We have Dr. Rosalie Elenitsas coming to us from Penn. Dr. Ronald Rapini, who's coming to us from MD Anderson in University of Texas. Susan Pei, who's coming from Roswell Park Cancer Center. Brandon Umphress is unfortunately not able to join us today, but I do know that he is very excited to be a part of the process. George Roman, who is just about to finish his Derm Path Fellowship over at Ohio State. So congratulations, George, one more day left. And then on the other hand, we have Tim Wizosin, who's about to start his Derm Path Fellowship over at Indiana. So we're going to have perspectives from two different fellows, one toward the end of their fellowship and one at the beginning of their fellowship. And also, who's not on this PowerPoint, but who also deserves a really amazing round of applause, is Tom Helm, who really was a great advisor with this process and is going to be helping us to moderate our question and answer session. So in terms of the process, what we're going to do is we're going to be dividing this into different sections. The first one is going to be talking about ACGME and program requirements. Then we're going to be going into a discussion about the application process, followed by interviews, both in person and virtual, as well as some high-yield questions and perspectives for our different panelists, knowing that they're at different stages of career and training. At the end, we'll have some time for additional Q&A, but I do want to encourage our participants to add in their Q&A throughout the process. We'll be monitoring this, and we'll try to ask those interspersed between the different processes. All right, then. So starting off, we're going to go through the section about the ACGME program requirements. And Catherine, I am going to pass it over to you to get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex. I just want to welcome everyone for joining us and thank all our panelists for taking time out of their busy schedules to contribute. So the Dermatopathology Fellowship is somewhat unique in that it's one of the few fellowships or a minority of fellowships where you can have different training backgrounds. You can be pathology trained or you can be dermatology trained. The official ACGME requirements are a 12-month training fellowship. If you are dermatology trained, so everybody spends 4 months of that 12-month fellowship doing dermatopathology with a minimum of 5,000 specimens. The remaining 8 months, if you're dermatology trained, you have to spend 50% of your week in a dermatology clinic seeing patients with a minimum of 1,000 patients. And if you are if you're pathology trained, you do dermatology clinic. If you're a dermatology clinic, you spend those 8 months, 50% of your time in anatomic pathology with a requirement of 1,000 surgical specimens and 200 cytology specimens. So we're going to kind of talk about how these requirements are met in different programs. And I was hoping, Dr. Elenitsas, if you could start us off and kind of talk about how your fellows with different training backgrounds kind of fulfill these requirements at your program.
Sure. And we do exactly what you said. We go by the requirements. When you have you have your 4 months of pathology and 4 months of dermatology, but they are half days. So throughout the entire year, you are spending some time in DermPath. So we see the DermPath fellows every single day. And for us, we spend the afternoons in either dermatology or pathology. And so for example, if you're derm trained, for our pathology, our fellows rotate through general surgical pathology, just to get, basics in surgical pathology. We also work in heme path to help out in those cutaneous lymphoproliferative disorders. We do cytology, which is one of the requirements. And we also do soft tissue pathology, because I think those it's one of the subspecialties in pathology that is really relevant to DermPath. If you're path trained and you have to get your derm training in, we get our fellows in several different clinics. We have our main university clinic. We have a VA clinic, which is always high yield because there are a lot of patients there. And we also work in a lot of clinical conferences. It used to be these conferences saw live patients. They've now sort of transitioned to virtual patients, but we work that into our clinical derm training as well.
Thank you so much. Could you elaborate a little bit about the complement and how many fellows you take, and generally kind of what kind of backgrounds they would have?
Yeah, so I think every program has their preferences. We have 2 fellowship positions. We don't have a specific preference to derm trained or path trained. We interview both. We try to choose who we think is a good applicant and who would fit well with our program. I do believe there are some programs that have sort of goals. They might take one derm and one path, or they may have a preference. But we have historically been all over the board, sometimes 2 derm, sometimes 2 path, sometimes 1 and 1.
Perfect. So Dr. Rapini, could you tell us a little bit about your program and complement and how your fellows kind of fulfill the ACGME requirements? And you're muted. Dr. Rapini, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. Sometimes it's better if I'm muted, but at least my wife thinks so. That was a joke, huh? Well, there are 2 programs here in Houston. There's the MD Anderson program, which I'm affiliated with. I'm the chief of dermatology at MD Anderson, but I'm not the director of DermPath there. They have their own DermPath program, which is separate. And then there's the UT Medical School program. I'm the director of that program. They're 2 separate programs. Both programs take derm or path trained people. I think the Anderson program mostly takes path trained people. The program at the medical school we take a mixture of people. We're accredited for 2 people, but we usually only take 1. There are an awful lot of dermatology, derm path programs which have cut back on the number of fellows. The fair number of programs who are accredited for 2 are only taking 1. And when we were going over that at one of the recent meetings, we were noted that a lot of people cut back on the number of fellows, partly because of funding, which is our issue, is funding, because we're only funded for 1, but even though we're accredited for 2, but also because the job market for a while there was not so great for DermPath. I think it's gotten better now. I think there's more jobs in DermPath now, but a few years ago, it was a little bit tighter. So people didn't want to train too many people and find that they couldn't get a job. But pretty much we do the training just pretty much what Rosalie explained. We try to get the fellows involved in soft tissue pathology and heme path, because those are the 2 areas that they seem to need more of in general surgical pathology. And as far as the dermatology clinic, I think it'd be scary for path trained derm paths, but almost all the programs I know of, at least ours is like this. We don't really hammer them too much in the clinic. They usually don't have to do the notes or do the biopsies. They just kind of tag along and see the lesions. And there are some programs where they try to get the fellows to do the biopsies or write the notes and learn how to do charting, but we don't make them do that because we just want them to see the lesions and hear the differential diagnosis. Doing the charting in the EMR can be onerous, and doing biopsies can be onerous, and if you're not really, I don't know why a path trained person really needs to do that stuff, but it's just busy work.
We'll talk shortly more about potential changes to ACGME requirements, and we'll kind of touch on that. Right now, I do want to go to a question that we have in the chat. It says, do you feel like the total applicant pool is a 50-50 split between dermatology and pathology, or does it lean one way or the other? Dr. Elenitsas, have you noticed like a specific kind of lean in your applicant pool?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a tricky question because my applicant pool might not be the same as like Ron's applicant pool. I don't have access to the entire applicant pool, right? Only what the people who will apply to my program. I think we see a little more path trained applicants. I'm not sure it's quite 50-50. For a while, it was really, I don't know, I want to say 75-25 path trained. That it's come a little closer to 50-50 now, but I still think a little higher on path trained.
How about you, Dr. Rapini, about your applicant pool?
Yes, just like that, I would say there are a lot more path-trained people applying now than derm, although we get a fair number of derm-trained applicants, but there are fewer than the path-trained ones.
Yeah, I wonder if it also could be regional. I know that my program at Ohio State, and we are a Midwest program that probably has fewer dermatology programs in the Midwest in general. We probably are more in the 60% pathology and 30 to 40% dermatology. Dr. Kowal, I'm going to throw you in here. How about your program? Because you're also a Midwestern program, if you notice any kind of lean.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be, I would say probably along the same lines as slightly more path, but definitely a good number of derm people are coming through. So
yeah, and I see Chris DeMarco is participating. So he is program director at Brown, and also agrees that he sees more pathology trained applicants for his program as well. So, we're going to go to George. Tell us a little bit about your background and what your experience was in fulfilling the ACGME requirements in your fellowship year.
Yeah, so my background is I'm dermatology trained. So the time that I have to spend was devoted to the pathology side of things. And sorry, that's my cat in the background. He's going to be meowing in and out. My time was spent on subspecialties in pathology related to derm, so bone and soft tissue, head and neck, heme path predominantly. I had to spend a certain amount of time in each one. And during that time period, I'd say the emphasis was on that particular pathology rotation. I still did some things that were derm path related, but because of like the way the program is structured here, I was sort of homed within those other departments during my time with them. Yeah, so I think it's 8 months out of the year I was on derm path. The rest is sort of split up between the different pathology specialties.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for Ohio State, since George was is our fellow exiting our program, is that dermatopathology is not located where anatomic pathology is. So while we would like to have our fellow, see them every day and just spend half their time over there, logistically at this time, it's not possible. So you will see that kind of change amongst different programs depending on the logistics. Susan, could you tell us a little bit about your background and your training year?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. And I feel very lucky that I was able to train at UPenn's fellowship under Dr. Elenitsas. So I'm a derm trained derm path, and it's just like what Dr. Elenitsas had described in the program. One thing I really did enjoy was that we were on derm path in the mornings throughout the year, and in the afternoons on certain months we went to pathology. So my co-fellow and I, we were on. So we saw each other every morning, and it was nice, as Dr. Elenitsas said, to have a home base in derm path. So every day, even on the months that we were learning anatomic pathology and cytology in the afternoons, we still were able to preview some amount of derm path cases in the morning. And so that was very helpful. The rotations that I found that was the most helpful, as George had already mentioned, would be in heme path. Soft tissue is extremely helpful. And then also we spent some time with at a smaller hospital where it was more general surgical pathology. And that was very helpful too, just to learn some basics.
Great. So I have to ask, did you have to gross surgical specimens? And if you did, what was that like?
No, we didn't have to do that. I will say that I do I think probably if you're a if you're a dermatology resident going into a derm path fellowship, you probably have almost no experience with grossing and things, and I do think a little bit of exposure is helpful. I'm also in the fellowship class that graduated in 2020, so we were the first class affected by the pandemic. And I think there were plans in place where my co-fellow and I were to have seen some of the derm path specific grossing, because the derm path lab is a separate lab. Correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Elenitsas. But because of the pandemic that happened at that time, we weren't able to. And I would say right now in my current position, I'm based in the pathology department, and I'm very lucky that some of my path-trained derm path colleagues were able to kind of guide me towards some of the grossing questions. And this is to the prospective residents, especially the derm-trained derm path potential fellows, is that it is very important to have some knowledge of grossing. I have been called into the gross room for a below knee amputation of a cutaneous squamous cell carcinoma, where the PA grossing asked me what kind of margins do I want, and it's a bit overwhelming because you don't expect as a derm-trained derm path to look at an entire leg in a tub, but I was able to learn a lot of that. And so I do think in fellowship, if you're able to get some experience learning the basics of grossing, it would be helpful.
Great. George, how about you? What was your grossing or gross room experience?
I think you tried to give me sort of like kind of like field trip days to the grossing labs. I got to experience grossing in a few different settings, both as it relates to just run-of-the-mill skin biopsies, but also I spent a couple days over where they gross like big surgical specimens, specifically like big melanoma excisions, which I thought was really useful. I can't say I spent like an extensive amount of time. It was just sort of like go see how it is, figure out how they do what they do. It was sort of like bring your kid to school day, except I was a kid and I just got to watch the PAs and the techs gross and like teach me what things are from square one, which is invaluable if you're derm trained, because you have no idea how it is that they go about going from skin to slide, and there's a lot of unknown in between if you've never seen it before.
Great. I'm going to go to Alex to throw out some questions from the QA, and then we're going to move on to the next topic.
Yeah, we've been looking at the chat, and it looks like there's been a couple of questions coming up about research, and specifically, are there research requirements needed both for applying into DermPath, but also what kind of research is expected when you are a fellow? So I'm going to take the second part first, because I think that's a little bit more applicable to what we're dealing with right now. So Ron, maybe I'll ask you about that. What kind of research is expected of your fellows during their fellowship year?
Well, we have a one-year program, so most of the one-year programs I don't think put a heavy research load on the fellows. I think the two-year programs tend to make them do a whole year of research, or publish more papers, do more hardcore research. We expect the fellows to, at the bare minimum, publish one paper, which is a pretty low bar to heap over, but most of them do more than that. But that's the bare minimum, is to publish a paper and have a project on some topic that interests them. So we don't push it real hard. I think other programs may push a little bit harder on that, but most of the fellows publish a fair number of papers. But one-year program, you know, you have to learn a lot of stuff in derm path and either clinical derm or surg path. There's not a lot of extra time. Mainly that 4 months when you're not assigned to derm or to surg path is when you have time to do the research, and it's only a half a day for 4 months. So it's not a lot of time. I don't know.
Ron, what are you looking for in your applicants in terms of how much research they've done?
Well, the number one thing with me, and I think most of my colleagues here, is that we just want to have somebody as a fellow that we think we wouldn't mind sitting next to for a whole year. And that's the number one thing, is somebody that we think we will enjoy being around. Research is very important to us, but you know, we don't push it real hard, and you know, we hope that people are self-motivated to do it, and we were motivated ourselves to write papers, but you know, we don't make it a huge thrust. I know that varies. There are programs that put a bigger thrust on that. I mean, some of the people who do great research, you know, are sometimes, you know, I don't want to be around them, you know, because they're you know, some people just are not oriented toward being a joy to train, you know. So I just want people that will enjoy training. Sorry, I'm a little bit blunt about things sometimes. Sorry.
Anything else to add, Dr. Elenitsas?
I think that was a two-part question. Yeah, the requirements of the ACGME really fill up your entire 12 months. And so we are similar to Ron, and we don't push anybody to do major research. It is an ACGME requirement that fellows have to do one academic project, and that could be basically anything. It could be a case report, it could be a poster at the ASDP, it could be a case series, and sort of for the requirement, we're terribly flexible. But similar to Ron, many of our fellows end up doing, you know, a half a dozen papers. We do offer 1 or 2 years. Most of our fellows are just 1 year. We currently have a second-year fellow who is spending 80% of the time in research in a laboratory, and then, you know, 15 to 20% of the time just keeping up derm path skills. So we do offer that, but I have to tell you, it's pretty rare that we take a second fellow. As Ron well knows, everything comes down to money. And so having funding for that second year is not so easy.
So I know there are additional questions in the chat and Q&A. We will eventually get to those. We are going to move on to the next topic, though, just to make sure we get through everything. But Dr. Helm will continue to monitor the Q&A and the chat. And if we don't get to your questions throughout the rest of this session, we do have additional time for additional questions. So we're actually now going to talk about the application and timeline process, which can be one of the most tricky things about Dermatopathology Fellowship, because there is currently no match. So Dr. Rapini, if you could kind of tell us, like, when does your program open its applications, and kind of what's your timeline in terms of reviewing applications and doing interviews?
We follow what the ASDP puts on their website. It varies from year to year, but generally the interviews are in the summer, and there's a uniform acceptance date, and we go by that. I think it has been October 1st or something like that. It's published on their web, and we refer to the ASDP website on our website, and we follow those dates unless we take an internal candidate. Occasionally we've taken an internal candidate and then we drop out of that, but we try not to be inbred and take internal candidates all the time, but we've taken a few lately. There were a couple of questions on the chat. I don't know if you want those addressed, but I do think a lot of the derm trained people tend to gravitate toward the derm programs that have dermatologists as faculty. Our program, we try to take path trained people and derm trained people. We try to diversify it, but I think most of the derm trained people feel more comfortable in a program that has a dermatologist as the director or other more derms on there on the faculty, but it may vary a little bit. There was another question about do most of the path trained people have a previous fellowship? We find that almost all the path trained people are doing 2 fellowships, and a lot of them are applying to multiple things at the same time, you know, derm path, cytopath, heme path, or something at the same time. And then I say, which one are you really interested in? They say, well, sometimes they say whichever one I get. And a lot of them just say, I'm going to do 2 fellowships so I'm marketable, so I get a better job. So a lot of them are doing a second fellowship in path.
So just to go back to the timeline that Dr. Rapini was referring to, there is a general timeline that is agreed upon by a number of programs, not all, it is optional. My recollection is that, you know, applications open throughout September, but it is at the discretion of the program when to kind of close that deadline. And they may have interviews anytime through September, but the first day that they can offer a fellowship position to any of the applicants, with the exception of an internal applicant, is October 1st. And that applicant, the person they offer a position to has, I believe it's 72 hours for a decision, and any subsequent offer, they have up to 24, or they have a minimum of 24 hours. And so this is kind of a difficulty with not having a match. So we've tried to come up with something that can be somewhat fair in terms of a standardized timeline. But again, not all programs have to adhere to it. Ohio State does participate in that. Dr. Elenitsas, how about you, Penn? And kind of like, what's your timeline in terms of reviewing applications and doing interviews?
We accept applications all summer. We also adhere to the ASDP guidelines. We usually interview in September, and we adhere to it's October 3rd this year. It's usually around October 1. I think the challenge is the programs that don't adhere to the guidelines. It presents issues for the applicants. Some will be offered spots and they haven't had the opportunity to interview at other places. It's a little tricky.
So this is a chance for Tim to jump in. You know, what was your experience with, you know, dealing with different timelines and figuring out your applications, how to do this, and tell us about, you know, how you were able to say yes to a program.
Yeah, it was certainly very challenging dealing with different programs that had different deadlines and when they started even. I think I started applying as early as July to some programs and in August for others. I would say that there were several programs that I had offered interviews to me by the beginning of by the beginning of August. And then one of them was IU, where I went, and I ended up staying as an internal candidate there. So I took an interview there, and then I was offered the position very quickly. And so I was done in withdrawing applications by the beginning of September even. So some of these places that didn't even offer interviews at that point, I was kind of already somewhere. So I was sort of on that side of things with everything.
And Susan, how about you? I kind of can't, so you were 2020, which means you still had in-person interviews,
Yes.
Is that right? Okay,
Yes.
so tell us about your process in applying and interviewing.
Well, I was the class, I think that was just maybe the year before a bunch of programs had agreed on you know, to have a more general timeline. And so I was still the year where it was all over the place. I remember I submitted a lot of my applications in July, August, but have found out I missed actually some deadlines already. And then I had there were some programs that didn't review the applications until maybe October, etc. I was lucky to be offered several interviews, and that actually all were in September, October, and it happened very rapidly. And so I remember, for example, that the day after the day that I interviewed at UPenn with Dr. Elenitsas, that evening I got an offer from another program that gave me only a few days. And the morning after interviewing with Dr. Elenitsas at Penn, my co-fellow and I were both actually at a different interview in another program together. And at the interview, I had gotten a call from Dr. Elenitsas, and I still have that voicemail message on my phone that I never deleted because it was one of the happiest calls that I received. But at that point, it was very fascinating. I think I actually called back when I was at the airport to say that, I'm probably going to accept, but I formally accepted, I think, probably 1 or 2 days after that. The in-person interviews, I think, were, there weren't any weird questions at any of the programs I visited. I think all the questions are fair, things are expected. They ask you about whatever you put on your application, about some of the papers or, projects you were involved in. I asked a lot of questions. I think particularly when you're interviewing is to ask the current fellows what the program is like. I thought that was very helpful to hear. Yeah, I think it was it's overall been a very positive experience, and I'm glad that now it sounds like more programs have a more sort of similar timeline. One thing I do want to mention before I forget is that I think if you're a dermatology resident applying to fellowship, you have to be a little bit more cognizant of the deadline, because unlike most fellowship and Peds Derm fellowship, you're applying 2 years out from when you intend to start. So that means when you're a first year derm resident, you would be applying at the end of that year. And so if you at all interested in a derm path, you might want to start doing some preparations. And I remember, for example, in July, when I first started derm residency, I was applying to the ASDP mentorship award and thinking, I really don't have any experience, but I think I'm interested, because really by the end of that first year of derm, you're applying.
Yeah, it's been over 10 years for me, but I can say that, I had realized maybe August. And so the beginning of my second year of dermatology, and when I started looking at applications, a lot of them, the application process had started, the beginning of July or even the end of June. And some of that even closed by the time I had made that decision to apply. So that's why, this type of forum is very important and helpful, I think, to help people kind of plan accordingly. So I think, let me see if there's anything in the chat. Alex, do you see anything that, any questions?
So it looks like in the Q&A, there is a question about saying, do most programs follow the ASDP timeline, have their own application system which requires letters to be uploaded through the system? And then if that case, do you have any suggestions for that? For instance, requesting multiple attendings to upload letters to multiple programs through their online system. So I think distilling this down, it seems like, who's doing the timeline and who's not overall as a sense, and what do the application process look like in terms of actually uploading applications, and what's the easiest way to do that?
So I think we're fortunate enough to have, again, Dr. DeMarco in the audience, who is the chair of the training directors program committee for the ASDP. So he may have a better sense. Chris, if you're out there, the question is how many programs currently are participating in that timeline? And I can tell you, I don't know the exact number, but they are all listed at asdp.org. He may have left, but
no, I'm here.
Oh, you're here.
Yeah, so thanks, Catherine. We got, I think, about a response rate about half the programs responded, and I think it was about 80% were going to follow the timeline. The other 20%, most of them didn't do it because they had an internal candidate. So at least about 40% of the programs definitely are. We don't have responses from the others, but at least that's what we do now.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think, Catherine, at this point, we'll probably move on to the interview section. Thanks for being our moderator for that first part over there. So we've talked about requirements, we've talked about the ins and outs of fellowship, we've talked about the application, and now we're kind of moving on to that format for interviews, both virtual and in person, which we started touching on. So Rachel, do you want to moderate this part talking about the virtual and in-person interviews? You're also on mute as well.
Is that better? Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, I mean, so just, full disclosure, I've only been back in academic medicine for 2 years. So I started during the pandemic, and every interview that I've had has been, as an interviewer, has been virtual. And it was very, very different than my experience going and being able to meet people in person. And it's just a lot more impersonal. It's just a very different kind of way. And I don't know if most programs are going to move back to in person, but I kind of hope that they do, because it's hard to get to know somebody virtually. And I feel like also too, it was like I think they interviewed a lot more people too, because they could do it in a lot shorter time bits. But I liked being able to go to the programs and being able to meet, and I think it hopefully will go back to in person. But yeah, I think that this is your time to shine, right? So you've made it, you got through the door, you got an interview, and now you got to make the best out of the time that you have. And I think just for me, when I interview somebody, I like it when the person is honest, just kind of comes through with their personality. And, everybody is super talented. Everybody has so much to offer, and it's hard, it's hard to decide, who's going to be, the best candidate. I think it's hard. And I think Dr. Rapini makes a really good point in saying that, when you know the person, it's nice because you know that you're going to be spending, a whole lot of time with them. And so you want to be able to have that interaction. And again, it's a lot harder to do virtually. But I'm definitely opening it up to the group to see, what's your experience. And Dr. Rapini or Elenitsas, if you want to, jump in and kind of say, I mean, you've definitely been on both sides of the ways, virtual and in person. And I would really like to hear what you guys have to say about that, because I think that's I mean, maybe though, I don't know, like, do you think you'll go back to in person, or please feel free to let me know. I'd like to know what you think.
Well, I'm happy to comment. I would echo what you said. I mean, in person is definitely better. It's much better interaction in person. Having said that, we will probably be virtual this year. It's getting close to the time, and Philadelphia is a big city. We still see
Sure.
the COVID waves, and so we're looking to be virtual this year. We did have a discussion because we wanted to be in person. We feel strongly that it's better for us and the applicants to interact with each other. So we will eventually be back to in person. For now, it's okay. I think the plus side of it saves the applicants money. You're not flying in hotel and spending all that money. As far as number of applicants, we don't really do anything different. If it's virtual or in person, we still interview the same number.
And Dr. Rapini?
Same for me, as Rosalie said. The virtual ones are easier to do. It saves the applicants a lot of money, but they don't really get a big feel for what the program's like. They can't really look at the program, and we don't get as good of a look at them, but it's easier on everybody because they don't have to pay to fly and stay in hotels and everything. We took an internal candidate this year, so I don't have to think about it this year, but we probably would will be doing virtuals, I think, for times to come. It's just so much easier. I think the applicants seem to like it because they don't have to pay to fly around. If they're interviewing a bunch of places, they don't have to do that, even though they don't get to see the program very well. We have some people who come down and do sort of a visit to spend a week with us and things like that. You know, it's a little bit hard to arrange because of all the ACG, the rules that the institution have rules on visiting people, and it's difficult to get past those.
Yeah, thank you so much for those that insight. I think that's good to know. I don't know. It's hard to know when the virtual format will end for good, but I think, you know, that does pose a different kind of question as to, you know, when you're doing the virtual format, what are the kinds of things that, you know, stand out to you, right? So it's going to be different than meeting the person. I think when I did them virtually, I got to try to, it was interesting. Like I asked people, I saw things in the background, and it kind of sparked my interest in talking to them about, like, one person had a bike in the background, and I started asking them about that because that helped me get to know them a little bit, or a poster or something like that. But, you know, not everybody is going to do that, right? Not everyone's going to want to share that kind of, you know, that person, you know, that part of their life. So, I mean, if you could say one thing to people going out to interviewing, for me, it's honesty, like just coming through as like an honest person, sort of being down to earth. What do you guys think would be like the one thing that, you know, interviewers could or interviewees could focus on in terms of, you know, they're virtual now, right? So all you sort of see is from the you know, the neck up, and, you know, what would you say is sort of the most important one thing that they could do, focus on these days? And that anybody, please, you all have to interview, so you know, I'd love to hear what people think. Alex, do you want to? Yeah, Alex, no one's been picking on you to talk now.
No one is. That's what happens.
I'm picking on you now, girl.
I'm gonna say 2 points. So the first one was from the previous discussion about in-person versus virtual. This year, like many mentioned, it's likely going to be virtual for most institutions, but a lot of that actually has to do with the decision-making on the GME level. I can tell you, for instance, at Penn State, they made the requirement that everyone was just going to go virtual. This was a new thing that just came out. And so even though each program may have a preference for virtual versus in-person, sometimes these decisions are being made, at least in the larger academic centers, at an institutional level. So there may not be as much leeway. All right, so then you asked me the second one, what am I looking for when I'm, you know, interviewing? I think, as many mentioned, it's the same both whether you're in person and virtual. Who are you getting along with? Can you, you know, have a conversation maybe that has nothing to do with dermatopathology? Because we know that we're all going to be sitting together for hours at a time at the scope. So we want to make sure that, you know, we're able to have a free-flowing conversation about anything and everything. And I think that that's actually the highlight of the fellowship year, is both learning, but learning in this really kind of fun, informal way. But like you, Rachel, I also believe in the importance of, in virtual interviews, picking up what's in the background. There's actually a really kind of cool idea when you talk about stage setup. It's called mise en scène, where it talks about the way everything is set up in the background of the stage. So think about your interview background as your stage, set it up in a way that might provoke questions or may bring out information that may not come up in your application. And I think that's also a really good way to provoke some free-flowing conversation. So yes, I'm now officially picked on.
Catherine?
You're asking me?
You got it.
Okay, so the question is specifically,
like, what's the one thing that, you know, that kind of, like, when you leave an interview, like, you kind of pull away from, like, something that, like, you know, makes you remember that person more, or something that really, you know, gets to, like, what's most important to you in terms of getting something from that virtual interview? I mean, it's a different situation now, so I know it's hard. It's really hard because it's just, you know, it's a very different kind of way of getting to know someone.
That is really hard to answer. So I can say what I am looking for is, or what Dr. Rapini said earlier, is that someone I can sit with every day and not lose my mind or worse. So, and that's really the number one priority, and number two and number 3 through 5 for me. And you know, all the other stuff I think falls in place. If it's someone that I feel that it's a good fit, then I'm just gonna have to trust that I can teach them well during that year. Virtual interviews, it's tough. One thing, you know, because you can remember good and you can remember bad. So, you know, George's interview was our first year doing virtual because we had a change in personnel. So we had it actually later in the year. So I think that year, his year of interviews, probably a lot of programs did them in person, but by the time we interviewed him, it was not only virtual, but he was managing a COVID floor. So in the middle, he was like, gotta go, someone, you know, crumping from COVID and you know, lights out. So, but at the same time, there's another virtual interview, and all I remember about this applicant was the plant. So it's the mise en scène that Alex was talking about. She put this giant plant next to her, and that's all I remember. So, you know, it can really go both ways. But I can say what I'm looking for is just someone that I think is a good fit and that is teachable. I don't care about, you know, necessarily a good knowledge base, because I think that's what fellowship is for. You get a year to learn the stuff. So it's everything else.
Okay, so do we have anyone else that would like to add anything about interviewing? If not, I think looks like we might want to move on.
I can comment just briefly. You know, when virtual Zooms and interviews and came out, you could actually find a lot of guidance online about what you should and what you shouldn't do. And some of that is worth looking at, because you don't want to have something at your interview that's just distracting. And maybe for you, the bike was interesting, but maybe for somebody else, it would have been distracting. And I think a lot of the guidance is to keep your backgrounds simple. But we do what the rest of you do. You know, you try to find candidates who you connect with and have a conversation with. And, you know, we have 6 faculty in our Derm Path group, and it's always interesting afterwards that the 6 of us don't connect with the same person. So, but we are very similar in that thinking.
Interesting, Rose. I see Susan has the most clean background there, and she was your choice, you know, whereas Ron and I got lots of stuff in our background. So, you know, definitely people have different things. There were a couple questions that we could maybe look at in the chat. And I don't know, Chris, are you still on? Because there's a question about the % of match rate into the fellowship. And I'm wondering if any of us know the answer. I do not. And then there's another question that we should look at. How did you know that you wanted to do Derm Path? For Derm residents with limited path exposure, are there recommendations for how to get more exposure? So Chris, I see you're there. Can you give us your input?
Yeah, I don't think we have any specific data on the match rate because we don't have a total number of applicants, which is, as was said earlier, because there's no match. There's, you know, when I was applying, that was the year they tried to get on ERAS, and they started, and then it kind of fell halfway. So the problem is we don't have the total number of poll applicants. At least from what I've seen, I mean, most people, I haven't had trouble getting into a Derm Path fellowship, you know, kind of like eventually. I've had a few people had to apply a few times, but I haven't met too many people that kind of gave up after that. So I feel like odds are still pretty good. It just may take a few years to find that, you know, program that really fits best with you. And then, I'm sorry, Tom, I forgot the second question. Oh, you're muted, Tom.
Yeah, you're muted, Tom.
There are some questions about, you know, how to prepare, how to get exposure. Let me go through a couple of the questions real quick here. Do all programs accept applicants 2 years in advance? And then how did you know that you wanted to do derm path? So maybe someone like Susan could answer that. Those are the main questions.
I think right now, I think the majority of programs, there were one or two that I knew of that it took applicants the year of. But I know one of them, which was Roger Williams, which is also in Providence, just closed their fellowship. So I don't know if there's any others right now, but there used to be a few. And I'll leave it to the others for the other question.
Susan, do you want to talk to us about your journey for DermPath?
Sure. So like I mentioned before, I do think if you're a derm resident, the timeline is a little bit closer because, you know, by the time when you're applying, you're actually at the end of your first derm residency year. So for me, when I started derm residency, actually even in internship year, I had thought that, you know, I would enjoy DermPath. When I was a medical student, I did a dermatology rotation and a pathology rotation back to back. And I was debating on which I was going to apply for residency. So I had some idea, but you don't really know until you're actually, you know, I didn't know if I just liked the idea of DermPath, and I wasn't sure, you know, would I really enjoy looking at slides, etc. I would say that I was lucky that my derm residency was very supportive. And so even though we generally didn't have residents do away rotations, I was able to work around that. So what I did July of, you know, when I started derm residency was I decided to apply for an ASDP mentorship award. And I would encourage any, whether you're a derm resident or a pathology resident, if you're interested in DermPath to apply for one of those awards. It's great. You will be able to do a project with a mentor in that area at University at Buffalo that my hospital is affiliated with. We have a pathology resident who is successful in obtaining one of the mentorship awards and for just this past year. So that was very helpful. And then otherwise, I talked to my program director you know, I was able to, we didn't have any electives at that time for first year derm residents. So the soonest I could do that would be as the very first rotation in my second year. And I was able to arrange that, which was very helpful. And so that's when I started sending in my applications, July and August. But it would be good to prepare for that probably beforehand. So I do think talking to your fellowship, your residency program director as early as possible to express your interest would be great.
Thanks, Susan. And then Tom, I'm going to help you out over here. Let me start also kind of fielding some of these questions in the Q&A and getting them out to our panelists. I know that our last section was talking about kind of these high yield takeaways, and I think that a lot of these questions will touch on this. One question I'm seeing is how many or what percentage of applicants do most programs interview? Now, we may not be able to talk about, you know, all programs overall, but Dr. Elenitsas and Dr. Rapini, do you want to speak about that if you're willing to share some approximate numbers?
Well, we interview very few. You know, we look through the applications and maybe interview five or six people. Sometimes we start out with that, and if it goes well, we take one of those, and if it doesn't, we add on a few more. So we probably don't interview very many. We do look at all the applications, and usually I find about 5 or 6 that really interest us. And that's how we've done it.
Yeah, we're probably similar to Ron. We interview about 10, maybe 12, but we've got 2 positions. So I think Ron has 1 position. So I think it sort of is a similar percentage.
And then actually going to the chat, there's an interesting question that came up, which was about what recommendations do you have to improve or tailor your CV in order to increase your chances of getting a DermPath interview? This would be for anyone in the group, since I know a lot of people on the panel review applications.
I would say the CV is one thing, but the letters seem to, you know, because letters from people I know, you know, I look at that first because I trust some people to tell me these things, you know, and those help a lot, the letters. The CV, you know, it's hard to say what to put in there. If some programs really want somebody who's going to do a lot of research, and if you have a lot of publications, that'll be great. I find it hard to get the feel for the person from the CVs sometimes.
Yeah, I would agree with Ron. The one thing I would definitely say is proofread your CV. If I pick up a CV and it has misspellings and disorganization, that's probably going to put that application aside. And so that's almost more important than the actual content.
And then also for those, for our incoming fellows and current fellows, was there anything in particular you felt you added to your CV that helped you as you were going through the DermPath application and interview cycle?
Probably the thing that makes you stand out the most, because most fellowship applicants are like pretty impressive people to begin with, and you know, it just comes to like research or, you know, where you come from or what you've done, sort of thing. Personalizing the CV, so they get a little bit of flavor of like who you are, because again, you know, they don't interview many people, so they have to be selective about the people they think they're going to like the most, or be able to spend enough time with that, you know, you're not sick of them by the end of the year. So I remember like in my CV, both for my applications to med school, residency, and fellowship, I always talked about like my cat. You know, he's been with me for a long time. I talk about my other sort of like very, very particular interests, like watching anime specifically. You know, just things that make you, things that, you know, you like to do. We all want to make a good impression to, you know, the program directors, but you also want to stand out, and how you stand out. I mean, yeah, you can add a little flavor to your CV, and I think that helps. And I think that helped me. I don't know if Dr. Chung, if you would agree. I don't think you even remember. Do you remember the stuff that was on my CV?
Sorry, I actually don't. And I'm surprised, because I feel like a CV all about a cat, I probably wouldn't have interviewed you.
It was just like a few lines in there.
But I do have to echo what Dr. Elenitsas says, that typos and grammar mistakes, it almost makes me just throw out the application, because to me, you know, we type up reports all day, and if I think you can't succeed at that, you know, you're starting off kind of behind. So it's really important to you know, look over everything carefully.
And then Tim, what do you think were the winning aspects of your application? This was a question that came in that dovetailed nicely with what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a challenging question. I think a lot of it for me probably came down to strong letters of recommendation, and then a personal statement where I could really, you know, give somebody an idea of who I was, other than just kind of the metrics and those types of things. But yeah, I think definitely having letters of recommendation that are strong is very helpful. And I emphasize that because when I asked for the letters of recommendation, I made sure that they could write me a strong letter of recommendation and do that sort of thing. So I think that helps. But then also the personal statement where, you know, you can go beyond, you know, just I went beyond, you know, why I wanted to be a DermPath person, tried to give them a kind of a look into my life and some of my other passions beyond that. So I think that was really my chance to shine, and I think that helped me.
Great. These are the really great insights. Now going back to the Q&A, there's a question, could it potentially help you to get a DermPath fellowship if you sell yourself as a package deal? So taking another fellowship the hospital needs fellows for. I know that's a little bit out of the scope of what I do from the day-to-day. I don't know if anyone on the group has any insights about this.
I'll offer some negative insight. I don't think we've ever taken anybody as a package deal, so that sort of caught me off guard a little bit. But I think the question is mostly for past fellowships. Is that right? Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I believe this kind of goes with some of the other questions about doing multiple path fellowships. So if the hospital has I'm guessing heme path and then derm path. So that would probably be where this is geared toward a bit more.
We haven't taken anybody for us the reason to fill it. I think if you saw the potential of someone to be a lymphoproliferative expert in dermatopathology, and you could foresee doing the 2 fellowships back to back, that could be a, good reasoning, but we don't utilize it to fill another position.
Then Catherine, I saw you went off mute for a moment. Did you have any insight on this?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't see that as a selling point. So, but at least at our program. So at least here, I would say that does not seem to be something that would be helpful necessarily.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'm in the path department and people are doing multiple fellowships. I mean, sometimes more than 2. And it seems that, people, I don't think that would be something that would matter that much, because people leave and then come back. And so, they go where they want to go, or where they can, where they feel like is the best. And sometimes people come back and sometimes people stay. So I don't get that impression that would be a huge selling point. So I second your, from the path side of it, where people are doing multiple fellowships, I don't think it matters. So.
And then what percentage of fellowship trainees at your programs pursue academia versus private practice or industry? And again, this would be for the entire group. I'm talking about each of your specific programs.
I think our program is probably in the 50-50 range. We definitely have people go into academia. We have plenty of people who go into practice. We don't select for one or the other. We take people who come right out and say, I'm going to do private practice, or people say, come out and say, I want to do academia. So, and in the end, I think we're about half and half.
And I'll say at Penn State, I think it's a little bit more geared, end up going into private practice than academia, though there are definitely still some graduates. Catherine, of course, who's a graduate of Penn State, who end up doing academia. So it is definitely program dependent.
Maybe a third of ours go into academia. I would say maybe 2/3 private, but it all depends on the job market, really. We have a lot of years where people want to do academics, but there's no academic jobs. And some years there weren't very many private jobs. It just depends on the market every year. I think a lot of it. I have a lot of people want to do academics, but sometimes they don't find the jobs they like, or some of the academic jobs stink and they don't want it, so they don't take it. Some of the jobs they want you to do not just derm path, they want you to do too many different things, and people don't want that job. It's harder to find 100% pure derm path jobs now than it used to be. Although it's getting better. I think it's better, but it has been a problem of.
Yeah, I think that those are great points. Now there's another question in the Q&A I think I'd like to ask George, Tim, and Susan. So looking back with your current experience, or I guess, Tim, you can think about it for your future experience. Are there features of your fellowship that you would use to set them apart from the others? Things like Associated Children's Hospital, Major Transplant Center, that maybe most people wouldn't think about when they're going through the application cycle?
I can start. This actually came up during our PEC meeting last week when I went to lunch, and we were talking about some of the strengths of the program here at Ohio State. And one that sort of like struck me as like a very obvious point, because we're going to be practicing later this year, we're getting digital pathology up and running. I didn't know digital pathology was the thing. Like even when I was a resident, until I became a fellow here, I'm like, whoa, there's a big, digital pathology aspect to the fellowship where I look at digital slides pretty much on a daily basis. And with the way the field is moving, the way technology is advancing, digital pathology is probably going to be ingrained within not just our specialty, but like, the rest of pathology. So that was a pretty big, unexpected sort of bonus for me coming here, because it's going to help me to transition to my future job. And being a major academic center is, par for I think most programs, but being a cancer affiliated hospital, I see a lot of crazy melanomas and sarcomas and things like that come through for people coming here for immunotherapies or research trials, and we get their biopsies to review internally, and that provides for a pretty wide breadth of pathology. So being affiliated with this cancer hospital or being a tertiary referral center is a big plus. But I say digital pathology actually was something pretty cool that I didn't realize until later on in the fellowship that was, yeah, it's a big selling point for this particular program.
I can chime in. I would say, looking back, if I were applying all over again, the things that I would really look for, and which I was glad that I was in a program that had that, or it would be nice to have faculty that are from both derm and pathology trained backgrounds, which was the case in the program I trained at. It's really nice because you actually see when they work together that they have different strengths, and you really learn from that. Another thing is probably the number one thing so I've been in practice for about 2 years now, just about. The number one thing I thought was so helpful from fellowship were all the CPC conferences. So we had DermPath Consensus Conference with all 6 attendings every single morning. And sometimes it was an hour long, which is full of cases. And those are the most helpful cases as a fellow to be able to see and learn from, because that's what real life will be like. You're going to have either cases are really tough, and you're going to see that your attendings, they all have some sort of slight, maybe stylistic, or maybe sometimes even some diagnostics, or just differences in opinion. But also sometimes there are cases that are not necessarily what you as a trainee would have thought would be hard. It would sometimes be things that are, maybe a little silly. Like if you think this is just reactive atypia, it's a really irritated SK versus a squame, which I think when you're a resident, you think that must be, that's not hard, right? But actually in real life, sometimes it is. And having seen a lot of those are helpful, because in my practice, sometimes one of the best things about my current position is that I am able to show my slides to my colleagues every single day. And it's really kind of given me this confidence that, that I'm not afraid to show anything. Sometimes you just want somebody to lay eyes on it, and that it's and I have plenty of experiences where I almost would talk myself out of showing them somebody a case, thinking this is silly, this can't be anything. But I would say, I would always, it's your intuition is right. If you're not signing it out right away and you're thinking, you're hesitating, oh, maybe I should show it to someone, but it's kind of silly, and it's not really a case you would send out for consult, do show it, because sometimes there's a reason why, that it caught your eye, that there's something off about it. But I think a lot of that I learned from in fellowship, all the CPC conferences we had CTCL conference, room derm conference, Mohs conference. I would say the Mohs one is really helpful too, because the Mohs surgeons bring their cases, and those are when you're out on your own in practice, if you're in a practice setting where you do work with the Mohs surgeons, those are the real life cases you have to, deal with, where, a lot of the margins on frozens, are they positive or not, when it's, or if they, throw up some immunos on it, how are you going to interpret it? So I'd say that's really helpful. And then another thing would be immunofluorescence. I think some programs maybe differ in how much immunofluorescence training they get. And so I think that would be really nice to just think about and ask, and to see, how that would round out your education.
I have something else to say to build off that made me sort of think about something that you just said was different fellowships have different sort of requirements in their day-to-day work of the fellows. So something that I really appreciate here is I see every biopsy that comes through, and I write up the report for everything that comes through. I follow up every stain, so being able to do the actual work of, a dermatopathologist where it's not just like I'm looking at the slide, okay, we're gonna talk about it at sign out. It's like, no, I actually have to write the report. I have to order stains. I sort of function in like a very sort of independent fashion, increasingly so throughout the year. But the ability to sort of give me that real life experience, because in a few months I'm going to be doing that exact same thing on my own, was pretty invaluable. Because I would say there are some other programs where the fellows don't preview everything that comes through, or the fellows don't write the reports routinely. So that was pretty invaluable for me in preparing me for the real world.
I also want to add on to that. I completely agree. At some of the interviews that I was in, so again, this is why it's really important to talk to the current fellows when you're interviewing, because they will tell you the truth, or you can read heavily in between the lines. And there were certainly programs where the fellows pretty much said they just sort of watched the attendings sign out, and they weren't really the ones trying to decide, am I going to order, what stains am I going to order, am I the one preparing the report. So it's really important. And so at the program I trained at, it was such high volume, it wouldn't be possible for the fellows to look at all the cases. But the advantage of having such a high volume is you do get a lot of the rare cases. And again, those, even though you may not have personal preview those will come to consensus conference, so you do get to see them. And then we did have sort of graduated responsibilities where the first month my co-fellow and I actually preview all the cases together, so it's nice to have a buddy. But then then we had to put on our big pants on, and then it was like, oh no, now that in August you're previewing on your own, and you realize it's not so easy. You can just nod when somebody else is like, oh yeah, I think it's this, and you're like, oh sure, I agree. But then when you're on your own, you're like, well, I don't know, do I really think that? And then we did have a lot of practice dictating reports. So whether you're dictating or writing, I think it is really important to have the opportunity where you're the one doing the entire report. Another thing I wanted to point out too is for some maybe of the dermatology residents, there are certain programs you go into where, especially if derm path is not housed in pathology, where they may not get some of the big surgical specimens with sentinel lymph nodes. But it's possible that, if that's something you're interested in, you could, ask the pathology department if, and your fellowship director, if that's something as the type of specimen you would like to see. And that was very relevant to me because when I signed for this job, I realized ahead of time that I would have to sign out the big melanomas with sentinel lymph nodes, et cetera. And I was able to actually see a bunch of those with a couple of the dermatopathologists in the pathology department that collaborated with the teaching.
Great. These are really great answers. I think there's a lot of good information here. Switching gears, there was a question that came in about letters of recommendation, and specifically, should letters of recommendation come from derm path attendings? What does the group feel about this?
I think that if it comes from a derm path attending and the recipient of the letter knows that person, it's worth a lot more, but I think you can have anybody write the letters if they write great letters. Great letters are very important, but I think letters coming from people that or just come up to the top because you know who they are and that you trust what they say more,
Yeah, I usually recommend to the residents applying that their best letters will come from someone who really knows them. If they worked a lot with them in their regular rotations, whether it's path or derm, or they did some project. And it's not important that it comes from the head of derm path. If the head of derm path doesn't really know that applicant that well, then the letter is going to read that way. If the attending really knows you because they've been close with you, that is a much better letter than from a figurehead who may be the head of derm path but doesn't really know you.
Yeah, I think that goes for any program you're applying into. Go with people who know you and can speak to your strengths, and whether that's someone in derm path or in another specialty. All right, so there is one question that, especially since we're getting toward the end, I want to make sure we have a chance to cover, and that's changes. So specifically, what changes do you see coming to derm path fellowships, maybe in terms of structure, in terms of education? There's been discussion about, things like ACGME changes for the program requirements or digital pathology. What do you think is one or two of the most important things coming down the pipeline we should all be aware of?
Molecular. I think that's becoming, as far as I'm concerned, it's becoming part of the diagnosis. I mean, if not, making the diagnosis. So being more knowledgeable about that and having, knowing when to send things out for molecular testing or when to send things in-house. I think that's a big change from when I was in my training program. So.
Great. Catherine, again, I saw you off chat, so I'm going to pick off you.
I actually was going to pick on Chris again, because I think he would have good insight to this.
Yeah, I can speak for the ACGME requirements. For people who might not be aware, the ACGME kind of does periodic major reviews, and so DermPath actually came up late this spring, early this summer, and so many of the program directors here actually submitted a letter asking for a reduction in the time that residents and fellows spend in the opposite residency, so derm trained doing pathology and path trained doing dermatology. These are only submitted, but we did ask for about a 50% reduction is what most of us agreed to. So you still have some time in these other residency experiences, but you're not spending the entire time. But that's still up to the final approval, which we haven't gotten the final rule yet.
It's great to hear about the changes that are coming. What does everyone think about digital pathology? Catherine, it sounds like your program's using it. What about in some of the other programs? Is digital pathology incorporated, and is it incorporated into fellows education?
I guess I'll go first. So OSU was the first institution to use digital pathology for primary sign out. Digital pathology had been around for a long time with scanning, but mostly for archival reasons or consultations. So we're very well integrated, and so it's hard to imagine life without it. But that being said, actually in derm path, we use it far less than all the other specialties of pathology at our institution, because we have so many specimens and they're actually coming through a different lab where they're processed. So if we wanted them scanned, they'd have to be shuttled to another location. So for now, it's only like the large excisions and the inpatient biopsies that are already done where our digital pathology scan center is. So our fellow fortunately has a lot of experience with digital pathology, but at the same time still a lot of glass slides. I do know that I think Mayo is like 100% digital, and kind of from my perspective, I like having the option of glass slides. Sometimes digital does fail, and I also have this problem, and maybe others, if you're using digital pathology, can speak to this, and maybe it's just me, with scale. And when I see like a dot that's like this big, I just get really confused. It's like, is that debris or is that a bacterium? But when, for some reason, when I'm seeing it through my microscope, immediately I can kind of tell the difference. So despite the experience, I still struggle with certain things that on digital compared to a glass slide.
So I'll comment about our institution. Maybe we're a little behind the times. We use digital pathology mostly for educational purposes. We scan slides for teaching conferences, etc. We are not doing any sign out digitally. We don't really have enough money. Hard to imagine at my big institution, but it's a big and financial investment to buy the appropriate scanners, have the appropriate storage. And so in DermPath, we're relatively small. So it's a big investment up front. I also think It will produce challenges besides what Catherine said, looking at dots. If attendings are doing some sign out from home, that means they're not at work and not as accessible to trainees. There's less interpersonal interactions, which I think might affect education. And so it has to be done right. That's not why we haven't done it. We're probably just because we're behind the times, and we will get there. I do also think it's tough. We're a high volume lab. We do about 400 cases a day. And so I think I could probably do that faster on my microscope than my computer. So I'm not quite anxious to do that on a computer.
Yeah, it's the same for us. We're all glass, but the Cancer Center is scanning their slides for education and for archiving mostly. They're scanning a lot of the slides, but I don't think their primary sign out is I think it's all with glass. Our primary sign out is all glass.
Yeah, I have to agree. We're also all glass, using some scanning for education. I mean, it's the way to teach, especially knowing that all of the exams right now are doing scanned slides. We are kind of gone away from glass slides for exams. So making sure that trainees are proficient with the digitized slides is important, but I'm also with you. I like my format for sign out. I think that I also wouldn't be too thrilled about rushing to digital slides, at least just yet. All right, then. Looks like we've gone through a lot of the Q&A in the chat. As we reach the last few minutes, for everyone on the panel, is there anything you think is important for our attendees to know? Something we didn't cover in terms of DermPath fellowships, applications, interviews, day-to-day? I'll leave that as our last open question before we end.
I'll have one comment that hasn't been said. I think we talked a little bit about knowing when to apply to DermPath. And I think, Susan mentioned that in Derm, you have to make that decision at the end of your first year of Derm. It's the end of your PGY2. I don't think it's that critical. It's hard to know at the end of your first year that you like DermPath or derm surgery. It's okay, I think, if you're in your second year, if you make the decision then. We've had a number of outstanding fellows who had sort of like a gap year from the end of their residency to when they started fellowship, and they saw patients for a year. And honestly, they were some of our best fellows. So if you're in derm and you're not sure because you've only had 1 year of training, it is okay to make that decision the following year.
I would also say too that I think in terms of if you're going for pathology trained, if you don't get it your first year out, it's okay. You will get it eventually. I was lucky enough to get it my first year out, but going back on it, I wish I would have taken a breath maybe and done another fellowship, just to make myself more well-rounded. So I think there's this like, I have to get it, but you don't. And any other additional training that you do is going to help you in the future. So don't be discouraged. And, if you want to get it, you'll eventually get it. I think you really will. And I think it's great to have more than one fellowship for pathology under your belt. I think it makes you more well-rounded.
I'd like to.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that throughout the process, when you're applying to places and you're looking at applying to places, most websites will list a program coordinator or somebody of that similar role that works with their department and their program. And just reaching out to those people, I think, can be very helpful. Most of them are super nice. They're more than happy to help you with whatever you need, give you more information about any program you're interested in. So just reaching out to them, I think, is helpful, and doing it sooner rather than later. And then just as you're applying, understand that everybody that you're talking to is a real person. So I think, being kind, being courteous to everybody along the whole way, and being upfront, if you need to cancel an interview, it's better to do that sooner than later, and being polite through the whole process. I think a little bit of kindness goes a long way in the whole process.
Well, I wanted to say that this has really been a great session, and I'd like to thank Dr. Flamm for having the idea to put this together, and Drs. Chung and Kowal for working so hard, as well as the panelists. I think a lot of things have been answered today, and I think many of us have emails that people in the audience can reach out to us to ask any additional questions that come up.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure questions will arise. I also want to put a plug in that there's going to be kind of a sister issue coming up talking about in the society scope, also talking about the DermPath fellowship process. So Dr. Elenitsas has been doing kind of double heavy hitting over here, and she sat down with a pathology resident interested in DermPath fellowships and did an interview that will also be available through the ASDP. That will also go through some of the information that we discussed today, but also some additional information. So if you have other questions, please definitely be on the lookout for the link to that video that should be available in the next few weeks. With that, it's 9:26. We'll give everyone about 4 minutes left of their time. Be on the lookout. There'll be a survey also coming up in the next couple of days so that we can hopefully continue this on an annual format and improve as we would hopefully want to. And thank you everyone so much. Thank you to the panelists and to the attendees, and have a great night.